6 months a widower. 1 overgrown lawn. She smiled when she wrote the first ticket. Then she wrote 50 more. My dog. My dead wife's roses. 3 years later, she picked up the phone and called it in as an armed emergency. When the door finally opened, the sergeant in charge went pale and lowered his weapon. My name is Walter Higgins, and for 31 years I carried a badge for the Chicago Police Department before I hung it up and moved to Willow Creek Estates, a quiet retirement community outside Scottsdale, with my wife Eleanor. We picked the house because of the desert sunsets and the orange trees out back. Eleanor passed 8 months ago, in March, on a Tuesday morning while the coffee was still brewing. Since then it's been me, my old German Shepherd Duke, and my granddaughter Mia, who calls every Sunday and visits when her journalism classes let her. I keep the porch light on for no one in particular. Willow Creek had rules. Grass no taller than 3 inches. Mailboxes painted a specific shade of desert sand. Holiday lights down by January 15th. Eleanor used to laugh about it. Said the HOA newsletter read like a ransom note written by someone who'd never had a fun day in her life. That someone had a name. Karen Whitfield, president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association for 6 consecutive years. Re-elected every time because nobody wanted the headache of running against her. She drove a white Escalade with a vanity plate that read Queen Bee, and she meant every letter of it. I'd met Karen exactly twice before Eleanor died. Once at a welcome barbecue, where she measured my hedge height with an actual tape measure while introducing herself. The second time was a board meeting I attended out of politeness. She ran it like a courtroom where she was judge, jury, and the only lawyer allowed to speak. Neighbors warned me early. Ruth Alvarez, 2 houses down, told me over lemonade that Karen once fined a widow for an unauthorized garden gnome that turned out to be a memorial for her late husband. The fine stood. Ruth said Karen had never once been told no and didn't know what the word meant. Frank Delgado sat on the board with Karen, one of 5 members, though everyone knew the other 4 just nodded along. Frank told me privately he'd tried pushing back on a fee increase once. Karen brought up his son's college loan co-signing at the next open meeting, in front of 40 neighbors, like a threat wearing a smile. I didn't think much of any of it back then. I'd spent 3 decades dealing with real danger, armed robberies, homicides, men who'd try to kill you before breakfast. A homeowners association felt like a rounding error. Eleanor used to say that was exactly my problem, that I underestimated small people with a little bit of power. The month Eleanor died, Karen sent flowers. I'll give her that. A card signed in looping cursive. For about 3 weeks, grief bought me a strange kind of peace. Neighbors brought casseroles. Karen waved from her car instead of stopping to inspect my yard. I actually thought, for a while, that people like her had limits. They didn't. Day. An envelope appeared in my mailbox. HOA letterhead. Violation notice. Lawn height exceeds 3-inch maximum. 48 hours to remedy or face escalating fines. I stood there holding it, thinking about the funeral 3 weeks earlier. The flowers still not fully wilted on the porch, and I felt something in my chest go cold. I mowed the lawn the next morning before sunrise, moving slow because my knee still isn't what it used to be. Duke sat on the porch and watched me work, confused why I was out there at dawn instead of drinking coffee with him like usual. I told him it was fine. I told myself the same thing, and neither of us believed it. 2 weeks later came the Christmas lights notice in February. Mind you, because I hadn't had the heart to take them down since Eleanor loved decorating that porch every December. The letter cited a January 15th deadline I'd genuinely forgotten. Fine, $200. I paid it, wired in ways that are hard to explain to people who haven't felt it. Ruth told me later that Karen mentioned my name at a board meeting I wasn't at, calling me a liability to community standards in front of the other homeowners. Frank said he tried to point out I just lost my wife. Karen reportedly said grief was not a valid exemption under the covenant. She said covenant like it was scripture. I started noticing her more after that. The way she'd slow her Escalade past my driveway most mornings. The way she'd photograph things with her phone held low, pretending not to aim it at my house. I'd been a detective long enough to recognize surveillance when I saw it. Even amateur surveillance done by a woman with too much time and too little empathy. In March, Duke barked at a coyote in the wash behind our fence, the way any dog would. Karen filed a noise complaint the same afternoon, time-stamped, with a decibel reading from an app on her phone. The board fined me $75 for excessive canine disturbance. I'd handled murder cases with less documentation than she put into that complaint. I decided to go to the next open board meeting myself, thinking a face-to-face, reasonable conversation might fix things. I wore a clean shirt. Karen ran the meeting from behind a folding table like it was a judge's bench. Gavel included. An actual gavel. For a subdivision homeowners meeting in the Arizona desert. When my name came up on the agenda under ongoing compliance issues, she read my violation history aloud to the room. Lawn, lights, dog like a rap sheet. I raised my hand and asked, calmly, if we could discuss some flexibility given recent circumstances. She said, and I remember this exactly, rules don't pause for anyone's convenience. Mr. Higgins. A few neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Frank Delgado wouldn't meet my eyes. I sat back down, jaw tight, and understood something clearly for the first time. This wasn't about lawns or lights or a barking dog. Karen Whitfield needed someone to control, and grief had made me look to her like an easy target. I want to be fair here, because a good detective always looks at both sides. Karen wasn't cartoonishly evil in public. She volunteered for the county food bank. She organized a 4th of July block party every year. Competently, generously even. People who only saw that side of her thought I was exaggerating when I mentioned the fines. That's the trick with people like Karen. They're never a monster to everyone. They're generous to the people who make them feel important, and merciless to anyone who doesn't bow. I've seen the pattern before, in interrogation rooms, in domestic violence cases. Public charm and private control aren't opposites. They're two tools from the same box. My daughter, Mia's mother, wanted me to just pay the fines and stay quiet. Dad, you're 74. Don't die on this hill, she said on the phone. Mia, 22 and studying journalism at ASU, said the opposite. Grandpa, document everything. People like her count on nobody keeping receipts. I started keeping receipts. I bought a small filing box and began saving every notice, every email, Every text from neighbors describing what they'd witnessed. 31 years as a detective teaches you that a pattern, once it's written down and dated, becomes very hard for anyone to explain away later. I didn't know yet how much I'd need that box. In April, Karen proposed a new rule at the meeting: no flags of any kind on display outside of official U.S. holidays, citing aesthetic consistency. I flew a small POW MIA flag beneath my American flag year-round, in honor of my late brother, who never came home from Vietnam. The rule passed 4-1. Frank was the one. I got a violation notice within the week. I took the POW flag down myself before they could find me, folded it the way my brother's unit had taught me 40 years earlier, and put it in the linen closet. Duke watched me do it and made a low sound in his throat, like he understood something I didn't say out loud. Ruth started calling Karen's growing list of targets the parade. She said every HOA president like her eventually needs one, a person the whole neighborhood can watch get punished so everyone else stays scared and compliant. Ruth had seen 2 other families driven out of Willow Creek in 6 years, both after very public disputes with Karen. I didn't want to be the parade. I wanted to garden, walk Duke at dawn, call Mia on Sundays, and grieve my wife in peace. But Karen Whitfield had already decided who I was going to be in her story, and I was starting to understand that, in her version, I didn't get a say in the plot. The real spark came on a Tuesday in May, 6 weeks after the flag incident. Duke slipped his leash chasing a rabbit and cut across the corner of Karen's manicured lawn before I caught up to him. 30 seconds, maybe less. I apologized on the spot. Karen stood on her porch, arms crossed, and said nothing back. The next morning there was a notice taped to my front door instead of mailed. A first, and a message in itself. Unleashed dangerous animal trespassing on private property. It read, with a $500 fine and a threat to report Duke to County Animal Control for aggressive behavior assessment. Duke is 11 and has never bitten anything but a tennis ball. I called the HOA office and got Karen herself on the line, which almost never happened. I asked, evenly, whether dangerous animal was really the language she wanted on record for an old shepherd who'd slipped his leash for 30 seconds. She said, I have to protect the community from what I don't know about your dog, Walter. That night Ruth knocked on my door with a folder of her own. 3 years of Karen's violation letters against other families, given to her by a woman who'd since moved away in frustration. Ruth said she'd been saving them for when someone finally had the standing to do something. She thought that someone might be me. I read through the folder at my kitchen table until midnight. A single mother fined for a trampoline that met every safety code. A disabled veteran cited for a wheelchair ramp Karen called unsightly, despite it being required under federal accessibility law. A young couple fined into selling their starter home after a dispute over paint color. A pattern emerged that any detective would recognize instantly. Karen escalated fastest against people who couldn't easily fight back. The elderly, the grieving, the financially stretched, the newly arrived. She left the wealthiest, most litigious families almost entirely alone. It wasn't about rules. It was about who was least likely to make her answer for anything. I brought the folder to Frank Delgado 2 days later, catching him alone while he watered his cactus garden. He looked through it slowly, his jaw tightening with each page. I've seen most of these, he admitted quietly. I voted for half the fines. I told myself I was just following the covenant. I wasn't her. Frank told me something I hadn't known, that Karen had personally handpicked 3 of the 5 board members, including him, after the previous board had once voted against one of her proposals. She'd run a quiet campaign to replace the dissenters, 1 seat at a time, until the board existed to agree with her, not to govern the community. She doesn't lose votes, Frank said. She removes the people who'd cast them. I asked him directly if he'd help me push back. Formally, at the next meeting. He hesitated a long time before answering, glancing toward his own house, his own mortgage, his own son's co-signed loan that Karen had once weaponized against him in public. I have to think about my family, Frank finally said. And I understood. I wasn't angry at him. Not really. Fear is a rational response to someone who's shown you exactly what she's willing to do. But it meant that for now, whatever came next, I'd be facing Karen Whitfield mostly on my own, with Ruth's folder and my own. I requested Duke's fine be reviewed by the full board rather than settled by Karen alone, per the HOA's own bylaws, a clause I found buried on page 40 of a document nobody reads. It was the first time, according to Ruth, that anyone had bothered to invoke that clause in the community's history. Karen was not pleased. The review hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out, conveniently the same week as the community's biggest social event, the Memorial Day potluck, which Karen chaired personally. I suspected the timing wasn't accidental. She wanted my case decided quietly, buried under casserole dishes and small talk, before most neighbors even knew there was anything to notice. Mia drove up from Tempe that weekend and sat with me on the porch while I organized Ruth's folder into a proper timeline. Dates, names, dollar amounts. The way I used to build a case file. Grandpa, she said, this isn't just a neighbor being difficult. This is a documented pattern of targeted harassment. This is a story. She asked if she could interview a few of the affected families for a journalism class project, promising to keep everyone's names out of it unless they agreed. I said yes, mostly because I trusted my granddaughter's judgment, and partly because something in me, the old detective part, wanted a second set of eyes gathering evidence in parallel. Karen found out about Mia's project within a week. Small communities leak information fast, and someone at the potluck mentioned it to the wrong person. Karen showed up at my door unannounced that same evening, smiling the tight smile I'd start recognizing as her warning sign, and said she just wanted to clear the air. Neighbor to neighbor. I hope your granddaughter understands defamation law, she said. Still smiling. Still pleasant on the surface. It would be a shame if a young journalist damaged her own reputation chasing a story that isn't there. It wasn't a threat you could report to anyone. It was worded too carefully for that. But it was a threat all the same. I told her, calmly, that my granddaughter was simply asking neighbors about their experiences, which was neither illegal nor her business to police. Karen's smile didn't move, but something behind her eyes did. Everything in this community is my business. Walter, she said. I built this HOA from nothing. I decide what kind of place this stays. That sentence stuck with me for days. I built this HOA from nothing. It was the first time she'd said something that sounded less like enforcing rules and more like defending territory. Like a queen talking about a kingdom rather than a resident talking about a neighborhood association she'd been elected, not appointed, to temporarily represent. The Duke review hearing arrived. I presented the leash slip timeline, a vet's note confirming Duke had no aggression history, and 3 witness statements from neighbors who'd seen the whole 30-second incident. Karen presented her own photos, taken from her porch, time-stamped to make 30 seconds look considerably longer through selective cropping I recognized instantly from my old job. The board, stacked with her people, voted 3-1 to uphold the full $500 fine anyway, citing the principle of the covenant over the actual evidence. Frank was the one dissenting vote again, visibly uncomfortable but unwilling to go further. I paid the fine within the deadline. I also made a copy of every document for my growing file. Ruth told me afterward, in a hushed voice at her mailbox, that this was exactly how it had gone for every other family in her folder. Evidence didn't matter in that room, because the outcome had been decided before the hearing began. The hearings existed to create the appearance of fairness, not the substance of it. A hollow ritual. I started to understand that fighting Karen through her own process was like arguing with a rigged jury. She controlled the board, the bylaw's interpretation, and the narrative she told the wider neighborhood at every potluck and newsletter. If I wanted a fair outcome, I was going to need something outside her system entirely to force one. That week I called an old contact from my Chicago years, now retired himself, who'd spent a career in municipal law before becoming a civil attorney. I described the situation. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Walter, HOAs get away with a lot because most people don't fight back long enough to make it expensive." He agreed to review my file pro bono, as a favor, and told me the same thing Mia had instinctively understood. Documentation was everything. Keep every letter. Keep every witness. Operating unchallenged for 6 years because nobody had ever built a real case against her. I decided I would be the first. By June, the temperature in Scottsdale climbed past 110 most afternoons, and so did the tension in Willow Creek. Karen seemed to sense that I wasn't retreating the way her other targets had, and her response wasn't to slow down, it was to widen her focus, drawing new lines around more of my daily life. She proposed, and passed, a rule restricting excessive early morning activity between 5 and 7 a.m., timed almost precisely to my usual dawn walk route with Duke past her house on the way to the wash trail. I noticed. Even Frank, in a rare moment of honesty, admitted the timing seemed specific to him. I rerouted my walks to avoid her street entirely, refusing to give her an easy violation to write. That apparently annoyed her more than a confrontation would have. Ruth reported that Karen had complained at a private gathering that I was being difficult on purpose, as though avoiding a fight was itself a provocation in her mind. Late June brought the pool incident. Willow Creek's community pool required a key fob for entry, issued by the HOA office, which Karen personally oversaw. Mine stopped working on a Saturday afternoon when I brought Duke's water bowl and my paperback to sit poolside, something Eleanor and I had done together every weekend for the past decade. The front desk volunteer, embarrassed, told me my account showed suspended pending compliance review, a status I'd never seen listed anywhere in the bylaws Ruth had shared with me. I called the HOA office directly. Karen answered, she often did, having centralized nearly every administrative function of the association under her own personal control over the years. Outstanding fines create a compliance flag, she explained smoothly. Though my fines had all been paid in full and on time, receipts in my filing box to prove it. When I said as much, she said there must be an accounting delay and that it would sort itself out eventually. It never did sort itself out. Not once. I lost pool access for 6 weeks that summer. In Arizona heat that regularly topped 115. While Karen swam laps with her friends every weekend and posted smiling photos in the HOA newsletter about community togetherness. I mentioned this contrast to my attorney friend, who said, dryly, "That's not an accident, Walter. That's a message." The message, I came to believe, was simple. Comply completely. Apologize publicly. Stop asking questions. Or lose access to everything the association controlled. One small privilege at a time. Until staying in your own neighborhood felt like living under occupation. It was a slow siege. And Karen was patient enough to run it for years if needed. In July, my truck, parked legally in my own driveway, well within the property line, was towed at 6 in the morning while I slept, on the grounds of a newly passed ordinance, restricting commercial-style vehicles in driveways, a rule apparently aimed at my 12-year-old pickup with a faded contractor's decal from a job I'd done in retirement. The tow cost $430 to retrieve, plus a $200 HOA fine on top of it, levied the same morning before I'd even noticed the truck was gone. Ruth told me later that Karen had personally called the tow company, using her HOA authority, rather than letting the standard automated notice process run its course. I filed a formal written complaint with the board, citing the bylaw's own definition of commercial vehicle, which explicitly excluded personal trucks under a certain weight class. Mine qualified for the exclusion by a wide margin. The board sat on the complaint for 11 weeks without a ruling, which under their own rules technically meant automatic denial by default. My attorney friend reviewed the tow paperwork and found something interesting. Karen had signed the tow authorization form personally, rather than routing it through the property management company as procedure required. "She's leaving fingerprints everywhere," he told me. "People this confident rarely believe they'll ever have to explain themselves to anyone. That's useful for us." August brought a new low. Animal control. Anonymously, that Duke was being neglected and left outdoors in extreme heat. A claim so far from Truett. Was almost funny. Duke slept in my air-conditioned bedroom every night and never spent more than 10 minutes outside during peak afternoon temperatures. Still, they had to investigate. The animal control officer who came out, a patient young woman named Denise, took one look at Duke's condition, my yard, and the shaded, water-equipped patio area, and said plainly that the complaint didn't match anything she was seeing. She asked, almost apologetically, if I had any idea who might have filed it. I had a strong guess. Denise couldn't confirm the source. Anonymous complaints stayed anonymous by policy, but she mentioned, off the record, that this was the 4th unfounded animal welfare complaint she'd personally responded to in Willow Creek that year, all involving households that happened to be in active disputes with the homeowners association. She said it carefully, but she said it. I added Denise's visit to my file, along with her verbal observation, dated and noted the way I'd have logged any witness statement in my old career. My attorney friend said unfounded complaint patterns, even without a confirmed source, built a compelling circumstantial case over time, a pattern that a reasonable person, or a judge, would recognize. Mia's journalism project had grown by then into something more serious than a class assignment. She'd interviewed 6 affected families, cross-referenced public HOA meeting minutes, and found a startling detail buried in the association's publicly filed financial disclosures, a special legal contingency fund that had grown from $11,000 to over $90,000 in 18 months. She showed me the filing on her laptop at my kitchen table, her finger tracing the numbers. Grandpa, HOAs aren't supposed to build war chests like this without a specific capital project attached. What is she planning to spend $90,000 fighting? I didn't have an answer yet, but the question sat heavy in my chest for days. Frank Delgado, cornered by Ruth at a mutual friend's barbecue, admitted under gentle pressure that the legal contingency fund had been Karen's idea, pushed through 18 months earlier under the justification of protecting the association from frivolous lawsuits. Nobody on the board had asked what lawsuits she anticipated, or against whom she expected to need protection. I started to wonder, uneasily, whether Karen had been planning an escalation against someone, anyone, for a long time before I'd even moved into Willow Creek, and whether Eleanor's death and my resulting vulnerability had simply made me a convenient, well-timed target rather than a specifically chosen one. Either way, the fund existed, and it was growing. Late August, Karen called an emergency board meeting, citing urgent community safety concerns, and for the first time listed my name directly on a public agenda. Discussion of resident W. Higgins' pattern of non-compliance and community risk. I found out about it from Ruth, 12 hours before the meeting, because Karen hadn't personally notified me at all. I attended anyway, walking into a room where 30-some neighbors had gathered, most looking uncomfortable, a few looking curious in the way people look at a car accident. Karen stood at her folding table with a printed packet for every attendee. My violation history, formatted like a dossier, complete with photographs and dates going back 14 months. She read through it aloud, her voice steady and reasonable sounding to anyone who hadn't lived the actual events, painting a portrait of an uncooperative, potentially unstable elderly resident who repeatedly disregarded community standards despite generous accommodations. Generous accommodations. I sat there thinking of the pool ban, the tow, the false animal complaint, and said nothing. When she finished, she opened the floor, clearly expecting silence or agreement. Instead, an elderly woman near the back, someone I didn't even know yet, named Dolores, stood up and said, "My husband died the same month as Mr. Higgins's wife, 9 days later. Is that also a coincidence, Karen?" A ripple went through the room. Karen's composure flickered for the first time I'd witnessed, just barely, a half second of something raw before the practiced smile snapped back into place. "Grief doesn't exempt anyone from the covenant," she said again. The same line she'd used on me months earlier, word for word, like a rehearsed script. Dolores sat down, but 2 more residents spoke up after her, each describing their own version of the same pattern, sudden scrutiny arriving at their most vulnerable moment. Karen tried to steer the meeting back to the matter at hand, meaning me, but the room's attention had shifted, just slightly, from my supposed misconduct toward her methods. I finally spoke, keeping my voice level the way I'd learned to in 30 years of interview rooms. "I'm not going to argue every line item tonight, but I'd like the board to explain why a $90,000 legal contingency fund exists and what it's specifically intended to be used for. Karen's jaw tightened. Frank looked at his shoes. That fund is confidential association business, Karen said quickly. Not appropriate for open discussion. I pointed out, as calmly as I could manage, that HOA financials in Arizona are legally subject to member disclosure upon written request, a fact I'd confirmed with my attorney friend that very week. The room went very quiet, waiting on her answer. She didn't have one ready. At her, Karen Whitfield stood in front of a room full of neighbors and simply changed the subject, tabling the fund discussion for a future meeting, while insisting my compliance case remained the priority. Nobody in the room seemed fully convinced by the pivot, myself included. I left that meeting with something I hadn't had before: witnesses. Dolores gave me her number in the parking lot. So did the other two residents who'd spoken up. Ruth introduced me to a fourth family, the Ortegas, whose teenage son had been fined for skateboarding on his own driveway. My file was no longer just mine. Karen, predictably, didn't take the parking lot conversations well. Within days, violation notices went out to Dolores, the Ortegas, and both other families who'd spoken at the meeting. Separate issues, different infractions, but all filed within the same 72-hour window. My attorney friend called it textbook retaliatory enforcement the moment I described it to him over the phone. That's actually illegal in a lot of states, he said, sitting up straighter through the video call. Retaliation against members for exercising rights at an official association meeting can violate both HOA governance statutes and, depending on structure, fair housing protections if there's any pattern targeting vulnerable groups like widows, the disabled, or the elderly disproportionately. I started taking better notes. Mia expanded her interviews to include Dolores and the Ortegas, building a timeline that now showed retaliation occurring within days, sometimes hours, of any resident publicly challenging Karen. She began referring to it in her notes, half joking and half serious, as the Karen kill clock, how fast a critic went from vocal to violated. September arrived with triple-digit heat still lingering and a new tactic from Karen. A mailed letter to the entire neighborhood. HOA letterhead, titled A Message About Community Harmony, describing unnamed, certain residents who were spreading misinformation and creating division for personal reasons. Nobody was named directly. Everybody who'd been at that meeting knew exactly who she meant. The letter worked on some neighbors, the ones who valued peace over principle, or who simply hadn't experienced Karen's methods firsthand. A few longtime friends grew visibly cooler toward me at the mailbox, unsure who to believe, caught between 6 years of Karen's charm offensive and a few months of documented but still unresolved complaints from people like me. I understood the strategy for what it was: divide the neighborhood before the evidence could unify it. Karen had run Willow Creek long enough to know that most people preferred comfortable ignorance to uncomfortable conflict. And she was betting, correctly in some cases, that a polished newsletter letter could outweigh months of documented, dated, witnessed harassment. Then, unexpectedly, things went quiet. October passed without a single new violation notice in my mailbox. No towed truck. No pool suspension. No anonymous animal control calls. Karen waved from her Escalade again like she had in the early days after Eleanor's funeral. Ruth said cautiously that maybe Just maybe Karen had finally backed off for good. I didn't fully believe it, but I let myself breathe a little easier. Mia visited for her fall break and we spent a full week just living normally, hiking a trail with Duke, grilling on the patio, watching old detective shows she'd never seen. For 7 days, Willow Creek felt like the peaceful retirement community the brochure had promised. Frank Delgado stopped by unannounced one evening, something he'd never done before, and sat on my porch steps looking troubled. "Karen's been quieter because she's building something," he said finally. "I don't know exactly what, but she's had closed-door calls with a real estate attorney twice this month. And she asked me for your mortgage lender's information." I felt the calm evaporate immediately. "Why would she need my lender?" I asked. Frank shook his head. "Walt, I told her I wouldn't get it for her. She said she'd find another way." He looked genuinely uneasy, maybe for the first time willing to admit that whatever Karen was planning felt different in scale. My attorney friend, when I called him, went quiet in a way that worried me more than any lecture would have. HOAs in some states can place liens against a property for unpaid fines, and in rare, aggressive cases, pursue foreclosure to collect, he said carefully. It's legal in Arizona under certain conditions. It's also incredibly hard to reverse quickly. I checked my filing box that night with new eyes. Every fine I'd received, I'd paid except the most recent Duke review fine, still under a formal, unresolved dispute I'd filed through the bylaw's own review clause. On paper, unresolved might look, to an aggressive interpretation, uncomfortably close to unpaid. If someone wanted it to look that way. Ruth called 2 days later, breathless, saying Karen had been overheard at the nail salon telling a friend that some people need to learn that ignoring the process has consequences, and that she'd found a way to finally get through to that stubborn old man. Ruth didn't know exactly what she meant. Neither did I. Not yet. Mia, back in Tempe for classes, kept digging into the association's financial filings between homework assignments, treating it like the biggest story of her young career. She found something odd in the county recorder's office database. A notice of intent to lien filed against my property 3 weeks earlier, something I'd never been formally notified about at all. I drove to the county recorder's office myself the next morning and pulled the document. It listed an outstanding balance of $4,200, an amount that didn't match any fine I recognized. Cobbled together, seemed, from every disputed charge Karen had ever levied against me, including ones the board had never fully resolved. My attorney friend reviewed the filing and found the flaw immediately. Arizona law required the HOA to send a certified notice directly to the homeowner before filing a lien, with proof of delivery. I had no certified letter, no signature confirmation, nothing. She either broke procedure out of overconfidence, or she assumed you'd never check, he said. I requested the HOA's delivery records through a formal written disclosure request, citing the same Arizona statute I'd used to ask about the legal contingency fund months earlier. The property management company, technically separate from Karen's board but functionally controlled by her signature authority, took 18 days to respond, well past their legally required window. When the records finally arrived, they showed a certified letter had supposedly been sent to an address 1 digit off from mine. A house 2 streets over that had been vacant and for sale for 4 months. My attorney friend actually laughed out loud reading it. "Walt, either that's the sloppiest cover-up I've seen, or she's arrogant enough not to care. I suspected arrogance more than sloppiness. Karen had operated unchallenged for 6 years, and unchallenged power tends to get careless, because it stops expecting anyone to check the fine print. I began to feel, for the first time since Eleanor died, something closer to focus than grief, the old detective instinct waking back up, sharpened by purpose. Dolores, the Ortegas, and 2 other families Mia had interviewed agreed to meet at my house one November evening, at Ruth's suggestion, to compare notes properly for the first time. Around my kitchen table, 7 households laid out 18 months of fines, notices, and retaliatory patterns, and for the first time, we saw the full shape of it together. It wasn't random cruelty. We realized it was a system targeted, documented internally by Karen herself in ways that would eventually work against her, escalating in careful stages designed to isolate each target individually before they ever had the chance to compare stories the way we were finally doing. 6 months too late for some of us, but not too late. December brought the fake lien attempt back to the board for what Karen probably assumed would be quiet procedural approval, buried in the last meeting before the holidays when attendance always dropped. Instead, I showed up with my attorney friend attending remotely via video call, projected onto Ruth's borrowed laptop screen for the whole room to see. My attorney introduced himself formally, cited the certified delivery statute by number, and asked the board directly, on record, whether they could produce valid proof of service for the lien notice. Karen tried to interrupt twice. The other board members, visibly rattled by an actual lawyer's presence, asked her to let him finish. She did not look happy. The delivery record showing the wrong address went up on the projector screen, side by side with the county recorder's lien filing. A murmur went through the room. Even the board members who'd rubber-stamped every prior decision looked uneasy now, glancing at each other rather than at Karen, who sat rigid, her knuckles white around her gavel. "This appears to be a procedural error," Karen said finally, her voice tighter than usual. "We'll refile correctly." My attorney pointed out that under the statute, an improperly noticed lien wasn't just refilable, it was void, and any attempt to enforce it in the meantime could constitute wrongful lien filing, a matter with real legal consequences for whoever authorized it. "Who authorized this filing?" one of the other board members asked, looking genuinely surprised, as though she hadn't known the details before that night. Karen hesitated. For the first time in 6 years of meetings I'd now heard about secondhand and witnessed firsthand. "I did," she finally admitted. "As president, it's within my authority to protect the association." The meeting ended in uneasy silence rather than her usual triumphant gavel-bang closing. Walking to my truck afterward, Ruth squeezed my arm and said, "I've never seen anyone make her answer a direct question in 6 years. It didn't feel like victory yet. It felt like the first crack in a dam that had been holding back a lot of pressure." Karen didn't retreat, though. Cornered people rarely do. In my experience, they escalate, especially the ones who've never faced real consequences before. 2 days later, Duke and I returned from our walk to find a Scottsdale police patrol car parked outside my house, and an officer waiting patiently by my front door, notepad in hand. "Sir, we received a welfare check request," he explained, not unkindly. Anonymous caller said an elderly resident on this street might be experiencing confusion, wandering, possibly not safe alone. I stood there, Duke's leash in my hand, completely lucid, having just walked 2 miles without incident, and understood immediately who'd made that particular phone call. The officer, a younger man named Torres, seemed almost apologetic once he'd spoken with me for 2 minutes and realized there was nothing remotely concerning about my mental state. "I have to log the visit either way," he said. "Company policy on welfare checks." I asked, as evenly as I could, whether he could tell me who reported it. He couldn't. By department policy, anonymous tips stayed anonymous on record. But he mentioned, almost as an aside while writing his report, that the caller had specifically mentioned my name, my house number, and a detailed description of erratic behavior that Torres admitted didn't match anything he'd actually observed once he'd arrived and spoken with me directly. I added Officer Torres's visit to my file, alongside Denise from Animal Control, building a second parallel timeline, official visits triggered by anonymous complaints, none of which held up under even brief in-person scrutiny by trained professionals. My attorney friend called this pattern weaponized wellness checks and said it was, unfortunately, becoming more common nationally. "It's a particular kind of cruelty," he told me over the phone that night, his voice more serious than usual. "It uses the fear of being seen as incompetent, especially against elderly targets, to intimidate and isolate. Sometimes it escalates. You should document every single interaction from here forward, in real time, exactly as it happens." I bought a small notepad specifically for that purpose and started keeping it in my jacket pocket. The same instinct that had served me for 3 decades on the force. Something in my gut told me, the way it used to before a case broke wide open, that we were still climbing towards something, not past it. In January, the pattern shifted again. Karen began attending community events. I also attended the farmers market, the library book sale, the senior center's Tuesday coffee hour, and would strike up loud, public conversations near me about residents who create legal trouble for law-abiding neighbors, never naming me directly, but leaving no doubt in anyone's mind. Dolores told me she'd overheard Karen at the senior center telling a small group that I'd threatened to sue the whole community over a simple dog fine, a wild exaggeration of the actual, narrow legal dispute over improper lien notice. The story spread faster than the truth ever could, the way rumors always outrun their more boring, accurate originals. A few neighbors I'd known for years began avoiding eye contact at the mailbox. One, an older man named Bill, who'd once helped me fix a broken sprinkler line, actually crossed the street rather than walk past my house, something that stung more than any fine ever had. Reputation, I was learning, could be weaponized as effectively as any lien. Mia, hearing about this during a Sunday call, was furious in a way I hadn't seen from my usually measured granddaughter. "This is textbook character assassination. Grandpa. She can't win the actual dispute, so she's trying to win the narrative instead. We need to get ahead of it before it does real damage to your standing here," she suggested, with the confidence of someone who'd spent a semester studying exactly this kind of manipulation in her media ethics class, that we request the full, complete audio recording. The HOA was legally required to keep of all official board meetings. Recordings Karen had always claimed were lost due to technical issues whenever anyone asked for them. This time, my attorney friend sent the request formally, on letterhead, citing the specific record retention statute, with a clear deadline and an explicit warning about the legal consequences of destroying association records under active dispute. 3 days later, remarkably, the lost recordings from 4 separate meetings suddenly reappeared. Technical issues apparently resolved just in time. What was on those recordings mattered less to me, honestly, than what Karen's scramble to produce them revealed. She'd been lying about their existence for months, comfortable doing so because nobody had ever pushed hard enough to test the claim. Comfortable lies, I was learning, only survive as long as nobody bothers checking the receipts. Late January brought Karen's boldest move yet in the public relations campaign against me. A community safety town hall, announced via mass email, ostensibly about general neighborhood security, but featuring, prominently on the flyer she distributed, a photo of a recent incident. My truck, the one legally towed months earlier, framed as an ongoing safety concern. I attended, of course, alongside Ruth, Frank, who'd started sitting noticeably closer to my side of the room in recent weeks, Dolores, the Ortegas, and 3 other families now openly comparing notes. Karen opened the meeting with a slideshow about protecting Willow Creek's values, and about 6 slides in, my face appeared on the screen. It was a photo taken, without my knowledge or consent, from what had to be her own front window, showing me simply walking Duke on a public street. The caption read, "Pattern of concerning behavior, repeated late-night activity." It had been taken at 6:40 in the evening in January, well before sunset. During my completely ordinary daily walk, I stood up before she could continue to the next slide. Karen, that's a photo of me walking my dog before dinner. What exactly is concerning about it? The room went quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when everyone senses something has just shifted, and quite a few phones in the audience quietly began recording. Karen recovered fast, the way she always did, pivoting smoothly. The timing isn't the point, Walter. It's the pattern of unpredictable movement that concerns some residents. I asked directly which residents had expressed that concern to her personally. She didn't answer, hand to claim the concern as their own. Dolores stood up next, unprompted, and said loudly enough for the whole room to hear, "I'd like everyone to know Karen sent me a violation notice 9 days after my husband's funeral, and I've watched her do something similar to at least 5 other people in this room over the past 2 years." The silence deepened. Karen tried to reclaim the room, raising the gavel, but for the first time, it didn't work. Too many people were now murmuring, turning to each other, some pulling out phones to check dates and notices of their own. Frank Delgado, visibly shaking slightly, finally stood up from his seat on the board's own table. "I need to say something," Frank said, his voice unsteady but audible. "I voted to approve enforcement actions I privately believed were unfair, because I was afraid of what would happen to my family if I didn't. I'm not proud of that. Deserves to know how those decisions actually got made." Karen's face, for just a moment, showed something I hadn't seen from her before. Not anger exactly, but something closer to panic, quickly smoothed back into composure. "Frank, this isn't the appropriate forum," she said sharply. Frank, for once, didn't back down. "I think it's exactly the appropriate forum, Karen. It's an open community meeting. The town hall ended in chaos rather than the polished image management victory Karen had clearly planned. Neighbors lingered afterward in small clusters, comparing violation histories out loud for the first time. Several visibly stunned to realize their isolated bad luck, with the HOA matched almost exactly what had happened to 6 or 7 other households they knew. I drove home that night with Duke in the passenger seat, my hands still slightly unsteady on the wheel, not from fear anymore but from something like adrenaline. The specific feeling of watching a case, a real case, finally start to crack open in front of witnesses after months of quiet, careful, exhausting documentation work. Mia called the next morning, having already heard about the meeting from 3 separate sources before I could even tell her myself. "Grandpa, this is bigger than my class project now," she said. "I want to pitch this as a real freelance piece, maybe to a local outlet. People need to see what's actually happening in these communities." I told her to be careful, that Karen had already implied legal threats once before, and that going public carried real risk for a young journalist just starting her career. Mia was quiet for a moment, then said, "Grandpa, you spent 31 years protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. I think I learned that from watching you, not just from school." February brought Karen's response to the town hall disaster, and it wasn't retreat, it was a purge. Within 2 weeks, she called an emergency closed session board vote and removed Frank Delgado from his seat entirely, citing a bylaws clause about conduct unbecoming a board member for his comments at the public meeting. Frank told me about it over coffee the next day, looking simultaneously relieved and unsettled. "Honestly, I'm glad to be off that board," he admitted. "But the way she did it, no warning, no hearing, just a vote among 3 people she still controls, it tells you everything about how power actually works over there. It's not a democracy. It's hers." With Frank gone, the board now consisted entirely of Karen and 3 members who'd never once voted against her in recorded history. My attorney friend called this consolidation, the kind of move desperate operators make when they sense real accountability finally closing in, narrowing the circle of people who might ever tell the truth under pressure. Karen's next move surprised even Ruth, who'd watched this woman operate for 6 years. She filed a formal complaint with Arizona Adult Protective Services, alleging that I, as an elderly widower living alone, might be at risk of self-neglect or exploitation, and requesting a wellness evaluation, not from police this time, but a state agency. An APS caseworker named Sandra called me directly, professional and courteous, explaining she was required to follow up on every report regardless of how it originated. She visited my home, spoke with me for 45 minutes, reviewed my finances at my own voluntary offer, checked in with Mia by phone, and closed the case within a week. "For what it's worth, Mr. Higgins," Sandra told me before she left, "these reports usually come from genuine family concern. This one didn't feel like that to me. I can't share who filed it, but I'd encourage you to keep whatever documentation you're already keeping. This kind of pattern matters if it ever needs to matter." I added Sandra's visit to my growing file, now thick enough that I'd moved it from a box into an actual accordion folder with labeled tabs. Police, Animal Control, Adult Protective Services, Board Meeting Minutes, Lien Filings, Witness Statements. My attorney friend, seeing it on our next video call, whistled low and said, "Walt, this is a case file." "You've essentially built a prosecutor's binder," he said. "Every category we'd need to demonstrate a documented, escalating pattern of retaliatory harassment, false reporting, and potential fraud, all with dates, names, and independent third-party witnesses who have no reason to lie for you. Most people never get this organized. It's going to matter a great deal." Karen, for her part, seemed to sense that her institutional tools, fines, liens, welfare checks, board votes were running out of runway. Ruth reported that she'd overheard Karen on the phone outside the community mailboxes, voice tight with frustration, saying to someone, "I don't understand why nothing is sticking to that man anymore." That phrase stuck with me for days. Nothing is sticking to that man anymore. It confirmed something I'd suspected but hadn't said out loud. Even to Mia, that Karen genuinely saw this not as a dispute to resolve, but as a contest to win. A battle of attrition where I was simply supposed to eventually give up or move away. March marked 1 year since Eleanor's death. I visited her grave alone that morning, sat with her for a while the way I did most weeks, and told her, quietly, about everything that had happened since the fines, the town hall, Frank's ousting, the growing folder. I told her I thought we were close to something. I didn't know how close. Mia's freelance piece, after months of careful reporting, interviews, and fact-checking, was finally accepted by a regional Arizona news outlet that covered consumer and housing issues seriously. She called me, breathless with excitement and nerves in equal measure, to say it would publish within the month, with her byline, using real names with everyone's explicit consent. "I want you to know it's not just about you anymore, Grandpa," she said. 7 families are on record now. The lien filing, the delivery fraud, the fund, all of it. I sent Karen a request for comment. Standard journalism practice. She has 48 hours to respond before it goes to print regardless. I felt something tighten in my chest. Karen did respond. Eventually, but not to Mia's outlet. Instead, on the morning the 48-hour window closed, a new violation notice appeared on my door. An emergency fine of $1,000 for an unauthorized structural addition, referring to a small wheelchair ramp I'd built the previous month for a physical therapy recovery after knee surgery. The ramp met every ADA guideline. My physical therapist had personally recommended it. I had the permit paperwork, filed properly with the county, sitting in my accordion folder already. But the timing, the exact morning Mia's article deadline passed, told me everything about what this fine was actually meant to communicate to me, and to anyone watching. My attorney friend, when I described the timing, went quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Walt, I think you need to prepare yourself. People who feel truly cornered sometimes stop making careful, deniable moves and start making desperate ones. The fine is petty, and clearly anymore. That can go either way." He was more right than either of us realized at the time. Mia's article published on a Thursday morning, headlined inside one Arizona HOA's pattern of retaliation against vulnerable homeowners, with photographs, timelines, and on-the-record quotes from 7 families, including me. By that evening, it had been shared widely across local social media groups. Comments flooded in from current and former Willow Creek residents I'd never even met, several describing experiences that matched the pattern exactly, A young family fined the week after. A miscarriage became public knowledge. A disabled veteran whose service dog was falsely reported to animal control. A widow whose late husband's memorial flag was cited as a violation. By Friday, a local television station had picked up the story for their evening broadcast, requesting an on-camera interview. I declined, still cautious about visibility, but agreed to let Mia speak on my behalf, citing our documentation. Ruth, Dolores, and 2 other families agreed to appear on camera themselves, their faces and names now permanently part of the record. Karen went silent publicly for the first time in the entire ordeal. No newsletter. No emergency meeting. No smiling wave from the Escalade. Ruth said her house blinds stayed closed for 3 straight days. I should have felt satisfaction. Mostly, though, I felt a familiar, uneasy calm. The kind that used to precede the worst part of a case. She's not done, I told Mia over the phone that Sunday. People like her don't quietly accept a loss. They look for one last move. Something big enough to change the story before it fully sets. I've seen it before. In real investigations. Cornered people either surrender or they do something that makes everything worse. The something worse arrived 9 days after Mia's article published. On a Tuesday morning in early April, exactly 1 year and 1 month after Eleanor died. I remember the date precisely because I'd circled it that morning as the anniversary of the day I'd first taken down our porch flag under threat of a fine. I'd woken early, dressed carefully in my old department dress uniform, pressed and stored for years, because I was attending a memorial service that afternoon. In Phoenix for a fallen Chicago officer whose family had relocated to Arizona, an old colleague's son, killed in the line of duty 18 months earlier. It felt important to be there properly. I was in the kitchen, uniform on, medals pinned, coffee brewing, Duke lying near my feet, when I heard it. Not one car, but several, engines and radio chatter, tires on the street outside moving fast and stopping hard. I stepped toward the front window and saw 3 patrol cars, lights flashing silently, no sirens, blocking my driveway. My first thought, the old detective instinct kicking in immediately, was that something had happened to a neighbor. Some genuine emergency nearby. Then I saw 2 officers moving toward my own front door specifically, hands resting near their weapons, moving with the careful, deliberate posture I recognized instantly from 31 years of doing exactly that myself. A voice came through a bullhorn from the street. Resident of 4417 Desert Willow Lane. Please come to the front door with your hands visible. My stomach dropped. Duke started barking sharply at the unfamiliar sound, and I told him, firmly, to stay, my training overriding my confusion in that immediate, split-second moment of pure adrenaline. I hadn't known yet. I would learn it all within the hour, that Karen had called 911 40 minutes earlier, reporting, in a voice the dispatcher later described as calm and specific, that an elderly male resident at my address was armed, agitated, and had made threatening statements toward neighbors, describing a scenario invented from nothing at all. She'd specifically mentioned, according to the dispatch log, that I was a former law enforcement officer with weapons training and access to firearms, a detail clearly designed to escalate the response level significantly, turning what should have been, at absolute worst, a simple knock and talk into something the dispatch system would flag for maximum caution and backup. I opened my front door slowly, hands raised and visible exactly as trained. Still in my full dress uniform, medals catching the morning light, Duke's collar gripped in one hand to keep him back from the doorway. 3 officers stood in a defensive fan pattern across my front lawn, weapons drawn but lowered, faces tense and alert. The lead officer, a sergeant based on his stripes, stepped forward first, scanning me quickly, the uniform, the medals, the calm, controlled posture of someone who'd clearly done this exact procedure himself many times. From the other side, I watched something shift rapidly across his face, confusion giving way almost instantly to sharp, dawning recognition. "Sergeant Higgins?" he said, lowering his weapon fully, voice suddenly uncertain in a completely different way than a moment before. I stared at him for a beat, and then it hit me too. Daniel Reyes, a rookie I'd personally trained during a joint task force rotation with Chicago PD nearly 15 years earlier, before he'd relocated west. "Danny," I said, my voice cracking slightly with disbelief. He holstered his weapon completely and stepped forward, and the 2 other officers behind him, watching this unfold, slowly lowered their own weapons as well, glancing at each other with the particular confusion of people realizing a call has gone somewhere none of them expected it to go. "Sir, we got a call describing an active, armed threat situation at this address," Sergeant Reyes said, "Still processing." Detective Higgins trained half my academy class on de-escalation and hostage negotiation before I even made the street. "Can you tell me what's actually going on here? Because this does not match anything in the report we received," I explained, as calmly as 31 years of training allowed, despite my hands still trembling slightly with adrenaline. Exactly who I was, exactly what had actually happened that morning, nothing, breakfast and coffee and an upcoming memorial service, and exactly who I believed had made the call, and roughly why she might have made it. Reyes's expression hardened as I spoke, the professional mask of a working sergeant sliding into place. "Sir, I need you to stay right here with Officer Kowalski for a moment," he said. "I'm going to need to speak with the reporting party directly." This report described immediate, credible danger. What we're looking at does not match that at all. He walked across the street toward Karen's house, where I could now see her standing at her own front door, having apparently come outside to watch the operation unfold from what she likely imagined would be a safe, satisfying distance. Neighbors had begun stepping onto their porches too, drawn by the flashing lights and radio chatter. I couldn't hear the full conversation between Reyes and Karen from where I stood, but I watched her posture shift dramatically over the course of it. Confident and explanatory at first, gesturing toward my house, then increasingly defensive, arms crossing, then finally, unmistakably, alarmed, as Reyes's own posture grew visibly harder and more formal with each passing minute. Ruth, watching from her own porch 2 houses down, told me afterward that she'd seen Reyes pull out a small notepad, the same instinct I'd developed myself over the past year, and begin writing down Karen's answers word for word, occasionally stopping to ask a follow-up question with the particular sharpness of someone catching inconsistencies in real time. When Reyes finally walked back across the street toward me, his expression had shifted entirely from professional caution to something closer to controlled anger. "Sir, I owe you a real apology," he said.
"And I think we have a serious problem on our hands that because
She described an active weapons threat, he continued, voice low but tense. When I asked her directly what weapon she'd observed, she said she assumed you had one because of your law enforcement background. When I asked about the threatening statements, she couldn't cite anything specific. Sir, that's not a mistaken report. Filing a knowingly false emergency report is a crime. I stood there in my dress uniform on my own front lawn, Duke pressed against my leg, metals catching the sun, and felt something complicated move through me. Not triumph exactly, not yet, but the specific, weighty relief of a case finally, unmistakably breaking wide open in front of witnesses who couldn't be dismissed or ignored. More neighbors had gathered by then, drawn by the flashing lights, phones out and recording, the same instinct that had captured the town hall meeting weeks earlier now capturing this. Dolores stood at the edge of her lawn, hand over her mouth. The Ortega family watched from their driveway. Even Bill, who'd been avoiding me for months, stood watching openly. Sergeant Reyes turned back toward Karen's house, where she now stood rigid on her own porch, arms tightly crossed, watching the scene shift decisively away from her control. "Ma'am," he called across the street, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet morning air. "I need you to come down here. We need to have a much longer conversation now." Karen didn't move immediately, and for a moment I genuinely wondered whether she might simply retreat inside and close the door, as though that could undo what had already happened in front of a dozen witnesses. Instead, after a long, visible hesitation, she walked slowly down her driveway, her earlier composure noticeably, permanently cracked. "I was concerned for the community's safety," she said, loud enough for the gathered neighbors to hear, clearly still trying to control the narrative even now, even here. Mr. Documented history of instability. I was acting in good faith based on genuine safety concerns for this neighborhood. Nobody watching looked convinced. "Ma'am, I personally trained this man," Reyes said flatly. "I've known him 15 years. He spent his entire career de-escalating exactly this kind of situation. There is no documented history of instability here. What there is, based on what I'm seeing and what several residents have told me directly this morning, is a documented history of you." The words landed in the quiet street like a physical thing. Karen's face went through several rapid shifts: defiance, disbelief, something close to panic, before settling into a tight, furious mask. "This is outrageous," she said. "I am the president of this association. I have acted entirely within my authority and in good faith throughout. Ma'am, filing a false emergency report describing an active weapons threat is a criminal offense in the state of Arizona, regardless of what title you hold in a homeowners association," Reyes said, his voice hardening further. "I'm going to need you to come with Officer Kowalski to discuss this formally. This isn't optional at this point." I watched, still standing on my own lawn, as Karen Whitfield, the woman who'd controlled every fine, every meeting, every narrative in Willow Creek Estates for 6 unchallenged years, was walked, stiff-backed and silent, toward a patrol car in broad daylight, in front of nearly a dozen neighbors. On the same morning she'd tried to end me, Dolores was the first to break the silence once the patrol car had pulled away, her voice carrying across the quiet street. "I can't believe what I just watched," she said. And then, louder, To the gathered neighbors. Every single thing that happened to Walter has happened to at least one of us too. Every single thing. Ruth crossed the street and hugged me tightly. Something she'd never done before in 18 months of friendship. And I felt the adrenaline finally start to drain out of my body, replaced by something closer to exhaustion. Sergeant Reyes stayed behind to take my formal statement, along with statements from 3 neighbors who'd witnessed the whole thing directly. "Sir," Reyes said quietly, once the crowd had begun to thin, "I need to ask you something off the record. Is there any chance this wasn't a one-time thing?" Because the way she talked, the confidence, the specificity of the lie, that doesn't feel like someone's first time bending the truth to get what she wants from us. I walked back inside, still in my dress uniform, and returned with the accordion folder, 18 months of documented fines, false reports, wellness checks, lien fraud, and witness statements. I handed it to him without a word. He flipped through the first several pages in silence, his expression growing steadily grimmer with each one. "Sir," he said finally, looking up, "this isn't a folder. This is a case." Every page for the department's records, explaining that what had started that morning as an isolated false report, investigation might now expand significantly, potentially involving detectives from the department's fraud and elder abuse units given everything he was seeing. I never made it to the memorial service that afternoon. I called the deceased officer's family, explained briefly what had happened, and they understood completely, insisting I take care of what was in front of me. I sat on my porch instead, still in uniform, Duke's head resting on my knee, and let the day's events settle. Mia arrived within 2 hours of my call, having driven straight from Tempe the moment I told her what happened, already pulling out her recorder and notepad before she'd even fully hugged me hello. "Grandpa, this changes everything about the story," she said. "This isn't just retaliation anymore. This is a documented criminal act. This is national-level coverage." By that evening, the local television station that had covered her earlier article ran a breaking segment. HOA president arrested after allegedly filing false armed threat report against 74-year-old veteran. Someone in the neighborhood had captured cell phone footage of Karen being walked to the patrol car, and it had already begun circulating widely online. The footage showed exactly what had happened: the flashing lights, the uniformed officers, Karen's rigid posture as she was escorted away, and, crucially, a clear shot of me, standing calmly in full dress uniform on my own lawn, Duke at my side, having done absolutely nothing to warrant the response that had descended on my quiet street that morning. Comments and shares multiplied overnight, the story spreading well beyond Arizona by the following morning, picked up by national outlets covering HOA overreach as a broader trend. Several journalists reached out to Mia directly, requesting interviews and access to her original reporting, the accordion folder's contents suddenly relevant to a much wider audience than Willow Creek. Karen was released that same evening on her own recognizance, given the nature of the charge, but the county attorney's office confirmed publicly the next morning that formal charges for filing a false report were being actively pursued, with an ongoing investigation into additional potential offenses that Sergeant Reyes's fraud unit colleagues were now reviewing. The HOA's remaining 3 board members, apparently realizing the scale of the exposure their association now faced, called an emergency meeting within 48 hours. This Time without Karen present at all. Held instead at Ruth's house, with legal counsel of their own hastily retained, clearly scrambling to distance the board from her actions. I attended, alongside my attorney friend, who'd flown in personally once the story broke nationally, no longer content to advise remotely from Chicago. The remaining board members, visibly shaken, asked directly what they could do to begin making things right, both for me and for the other families Mia's reporting had identified over the past year. You can start, my attorney said evenly, by immediately voiding every improperly filed lien, refunding every retaliatory fine with documented evidence behind it, and cooperating fully with whatever investigation follows. And you should probably retain your own separate counsel, because depending on what surfaces, board complicity in some of this may carry its own liability. Within days, the story had grown legs of its own well beyond what Mia, or I, or anyone could have anticipated. A consumer protection reporter from a major national outlet flew in to interview me directly, alongside Dolores, the Ortegas, and 3 other affected families, turning 18 months of quiet, exhausting documentation into a widely read feature story. The reporter, digging deeper than even Mia had time to during her semester-long project, uncovered something none of us had found yet: bank records, obtained through a subsequent subpoena, once the criminal investigation formally expanded, showing that Karen's legal contingency fund, the one that had grown to over $90,000, hadn't been sitting untouched. Roughly $31,000 had been transferred, in smaller increments over 18 months, into an account linked to Karen's personal credit card, used, according to statements, later reviewed by investigators, for a country club membership renewal, a leased luxury vehicle upgrade, and 2 vacations, none of which had anything to do with association business. My attorney friend, reviewing the emerging reporting with a professional's careful eye, said quietly, "Walt, this isn't just harassment anymore. If those transfers are what they appear to be, she's looking at embezzlement charges on top of the false report. HOA presidents have fiduciary duties. Diverting association funds for personal use is a serious felony." Frank Delgado, once removed from the board and no longer under Karen's direct influence, agreed to speak with investigators formally, providing detailed testimony about the meetings, where the legal contingency fund had been proposed and approved, and about his own growing unease at how loosely its spending had always been explained to the rest of the board. She told us it was for unexpected legal needs, Frank told the county investigator, according to details later shared with Mia for her follow-up piece. We never saw itemized receipts. We just trusted her, because she'd built this association from nothing, or that's what she always told us. I understand now that trust was never really earned. It was just assumed. Karen's husband, Gerald, quiet, soft-spoken man I'd exchanged perhaps a dozen words with in 18 months despite living 2 houses away, appeared unannounced at my door one evening during this period, looking exhausted and older than I remembered him. I almost didn't let him in. Something in his posture made me reconsider. "I need to tell you something," he said, sitting stiffly at my kitchen table, hands wrapped around a glass of water he never drank from. "I didn't know about most of what she did to you. I want you to believe that." I told her more than once it didn't feel right. She stopped telling me anything after that. Gerald explained, haltingly, that he'd filed for separation the week after the false 911 report became public, unable to reconcile the version of his wife he'd known for 22 years with the woman on the cell phone footage being walked to a patrol car for endangering an elderly veteran over a documented pattern of petty grievances. Our son, Tyler, hasn't spoken to her since the article came out, Gerald added quietly. He told her, and I heard this part myself, that he'd always known she needed to control everything around her, but he never thought it would go this far. He said watching that footage made him ashamed to share her last name publicly. I didn't know what to say to Gerald. Honestly, part of me still burned with 18 months of accumulated anger, and part of me recognized, from decades of watching families unravel around cases I'd investigated, that Gerald himself was, in his own quieter way, another person Karen's need for control had ultimately damaged, just differently than the rest of us. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Gerald said before he left. I just needed you to know that not everyone in that house agreed with what she was doing, even if I was too much of a coward to stop it sooner. I'm sorry, Mr. Higgins. He left before I could formulate any real response at all. Mia's follow-up reporting on the embezzlement allegations, published 2 weeks later, included an on-record quote from Tyler Whitfield himself, 26 years old, estranged from his mother, describing a childhood shaped by his mother's need to control every environment around her, down to what friends he was permitted to bring home and how they had to behave. She always said rules kept people safe, Tyler told Mia, in a quote that would end up widely shared across social media platforms covering the story. But rules were never really about safety. They were about her deciding who got to feel comfortable and who didn't. I watched her do it to me my whole childhood before I ever saw her do it to a neighborhood. The county attorney's office, facing mounting public attention and a strengthening evidentiary record, formally added 2 counts of fraud and 1 count of embezzlement to Karen's existing false reporting charge, elevating the case from a single misdemeanor-adjacent incident to a felony matter carrying, according to my attorney friend, potential real prison time if convicted. A civil attorney representing the 7 affected families as a group, myself, Dolores, the Ortegas, and 4 others Mia's reporting had helped identify, filed a coordinated civil suit against both Karen personally and the Homeowners Association itself, seeking restitution for improper fines, towing costs, legal fees, and documented emotional distress spanning 18 months. The remaining board members, now operating under their own separately retained counsel, voted unanimously to remove Karen from the presidency permanently, a formality by that point, given the criminal charges, but a symbolically significant one that finally, officially stripped her of the title she'd used to justify 6 years of unchecked, escalating control. Ruth organized an informal gathering at the community clubhouse, ironically, the same building where Karen had run so many of her rigged hearings, inviting every family. Mia's reporting had identified, along with sympathetic neighbors who'd finally understood the pattern once it was laid out clearly across multiple households at once. I stood in that clubhouse, Duke curled at my feet under the table, surrounded by Dolores, the Ortegas, Frank, Ruth, and a dozen others who'd each carried their own version of this exhausting year alone until the moment they hadn't had to anymore, and felt For the first time since Eleanor's death. Something like genuine community around me. Frank spoke briefly to the group, apologizing formally for his own role in enabling Karen's control for as long as he had. I was afraid, he said simply. Fear kept me quiet for a long time. I think that's true for most of us here, in different ways. I hope we build something different going forward, together, out loud, not in silence. Mia's original journalism professor, hearing about how far the story had grown, reached out to congratulate her and mentioned that a documentary production company had inquired about the rights to the full story, the pattern, the escalation, the false 911 call, the embezzlement, the reveal on my own front lawn. Mia hadn't decided yet how she felt about that. I don't want it to become about spectacle, she told me. Sitting on my porch one evening as the case moved toward its eventual resolution. I want people to understand the mechanism, how someone gets away with this for 6 years, how ordinary people go along with it out of fear, how long it takes for evidence to finally matter. I told her I thought that instinct was exactly right, and that it was, in its own way, the same instinct that had made her grandmother such a good teacher for 30 years before retiring. The belief that understanding a problem clearly mattered more than simply being entertained by its collapse. Eleanor would have been proud of her, I said. Mia cried a little at that. As the criminal case moved toward a preliminary hearing that spring, Karen's public presence in Willow Creek essentially disappeared. Her Escalade sat parked in the driveway for days at a time. The blinds stayed drawn. Occasionally I'd see Gerald's car alone in the driveway, though I later learned he'd moved into a rental across town. The property management company, under new instruction from the reorganized board, began the slow work of reviewing every fine issued under Karen's 6-year presidency, cross-referencing them against complaint patterns, timing relative to major life events, and board voting records, a process my attorney friend estimated could take the better part of a year to fully complete. Dolores received her full lien reversal and fine refund within the first wave of corrections. Along with a formal written apology from the reorganized board, the first apology, she told me that anyone from Willow Creek's leadership had ever offered her in the 2 years since her husband's death first made her a target of Karen's scrutiny. The Ortega family's teenage son, whose skateboarding fine had always struck me as one of the pettier entries in Karen's long catalog, received an unexpected bonus alongside his refund. A formal letter from the new board establishing an official, permitted skate area near the community park, something residents had informally requested for years without any traction. I sat with my attorney friend one evening reviewing the civil suit's progress, watching the accordion folder I'd built almost by accident, out of grief and stubbornness, more than any grand strategy, become Exhibit A in what he now described as one of the more thoroughly documented HOA retaliation cases he'd encountered in his entire career. You did what most people never manage to do, Walt, he told me. You stayed calm, you stayed organized, and you stayed patient long enough for the truth to catch up to the lie. Most people either explode too early and discredit themselves, or they give up entirely. You did neither. Think. I thought about Eleanor a lot during those weeks, wondering what she would have made of all of it. The fines, the folder, the false 911 call, the SWAT-adjacent response. On our own front lawn, the strange, unexpected community that had finally coalesced out of 18 months of individual, isolated suffering nobody had realized was shared. I think she would have been furious on my behalf. The way she always got furious at any injustice, large or small, throughout our 46 years of marriage. And I think, underneath the fury, she would have been quietly proud that I'd handled it the way I did, carefully, patiently, with evidence instead of anger, right up until the moment Sergeant Reyes stopped by unannounced one afternoon in late April. Out of uniform, just to check in, he said, though I suspected there was more to it than a casual visit. We sat on the porch with coffee, Duke immediately claiming a spot against his leg, and talked for over an hour about the old task force days. For what it's worth, sir, he said before leaving, that morning shook me more than I let on. I've done 100 welfare checks and calls like that. Most of the time they're genuine concern, even when they're wrong. That one wasn't concern. That one was a weapon, and it almost worked exactly the way she intended it to. The preliminary hearing arrived in early May, held at the county courthouse in downtown Phoenix, a modest, unremarkable building that felt strange to walk into given everything that had led up to that morning. I wore a plain suit instead of my dress uniform this time, sitting in the gallery beside Mia, Ruth, Dolores, and Frank. Karen arrived with a defense attorney I didn't recognize, dressed conservatively, her hair pulled back, looking, for the first time since I'd known her, genuinely diminished rather than commanding. Gerald sat several rows behind her, alone, having come, he told me afterward in the hallway, because 22 years still means something, even now. The county prosecutor laid out the case methodically, the false 911 report, the dispatch recording of Karen describing a fabricated weapons threat, Sergeant Reyes's testimony about the discrepancy between the report and reality, and, crucially, the pattern evidence drawn directly from my accordion folder and the 7-family civil complaint filed alongside it. Karen's attorney attempted an opening argument built around a good faith misunderstanding, suggesting his client had genuinely, if mistakenly, believed I posed some kind of threat that morning. The prosecutor's response was simple and devastating. She played the actual 911 call recording aloud in open court, Karen's own voice filling the room. He's a former police officer. He keeps weapons in the house. He's been acting erratic and threatening for months. I'm genuinely afraid for the neighborhood's safety. Karen's recorded voice, calm and measured, describing a version of events that bore almost no resemblance to the reality of a widower drinking coffee before a memorial service. The prosecutor followed the recording immediately with Sergeant Reyes's bodycam footage, time-stamped from that same morning, showing me standing calmly at my own front door in full dress uniform, hands raised, Duke sitting obediently beside me, the visual contrast between the described threat and the actual, harmless reality landing hard in the silent courtroom. Karen's attorney tried a different angle next, suggesting the embezzlement allegations were a separate matter, unrelated bookkeeping confusion rather than intentional fraud. The prosecutor countered with the bank statements, the country club renewal, the leased vehicle upgrade, 2 vacations, all drawn directly from the legal contingency fund homeowners had paid into believing it protected them. Frank Delgado testified next, describing the board meetings where the fund's spending had never been itemized or explained, and his own growing unease that had ultimately led him to speak with investigators. His testimony, delivered nervously but honestly, painted a picture of an association governed less by bylaws than by one woman's unchecked personal authority. Dolores testified about the violation notice arriving 9 days after her husband's funeral. The Ortega's son, now 17, testified about the skateboarding fine and the subsequent, unrelated animal control complaint that had followed his family's outspokenness. Each testimony, individually small, accumulated into something the judge visibly could not dismiss as isolated coincidence. When it came my turn, I kept my testimony factual and unemotional, the way 31 years of courtroom experience had trained me to: dates, documents, direct quotes I'd recorded in my notepad, the certified letter sent to a vacant house, the animal control visit, the wellness check, and finally, the morning 3 patrol cars surrounded my home. I described opening my front door in dress uniform, Duke's leash gripped tight in my hand, recognizing Sergeant Reyes from 15 years earlier, and watching a false, invented threat unravel in real time in front of the very officers it had been designed to weaponize against me. The courtroom was completely silent by the time I finished. Karen's attorney, during cross-examination, tried to suggest my extensive documentation itself indicated obsessive or unstable behavior, an attempt to flip the narrative one final time. I answered calmly that 31 years as a detective had simply taught me that patterns require evidence to be believed, and that I'd learned that lesson from cases far more serious than this one. Objection, the prosecutor said mildly, barely needing to raise her voice. Counsel is asking the witness to justify defending himself against a documented pattern of harassment. That's not obsessive behavior, Your Honor. That's exactly what any reasonable person should do when institutional power is being used against them without accountability. The objection was sustained. The judge, reviewing the accumulated evidence, the recorded 911 call, the body cam footage, the bank records, the 7-family pattern testimony, and my own carefully maintained accordion folder now formally entered as evidence, found sufficient cause to proceed to a full trial on all charges: false reporting, fraud, and embezzlement. Karen's bail conditions were modified following the hearing, restricting contact with any Willow Creek resident named in the ongoing civil suit, effectively barring her from her own neighborhood pending trial. Ruth told me later that a moving truck appeared at her house within the week, Gerald overseeing most of the arrangements alone. Mia covered the hearing for her outlet, careful this time to keep her reporting strictly factual, letting the courtroom testimony speak for itself rather than editorializing. Her piece was picked up by 3 additional national outlets within days, cited in several broader articles examining HOA overreach and elder-targeted retaliation as an emerging national pattern. I received messages that week from people I'd never met, other elderly homeowners across the country describing eerily similar experiences with their own HOA leadership.
Thanking Mia, for putting language and documentation around something they'd each assumed was just their own private, unwinnable battle with an unaccountable neighbor.
One message from a woman in Florida stuck with me particularly. I thought I was losing my mind. Every fine felt random until I read your story and realized it wasn't random at all. It was a system. It wasn't just in my head. I printed that message and kept it in the folder too. My attorney friend told me the civil suit was likely to settle rather than go to trial separately, given how thoroughly the criminal case had already established the underlying pattern of fraud and retaliation. Settlement talks began within weeks, with the association's insurance carrier increasingly eager to resolve 7 claims before a jury saw the full documentation. The settlement, finalized in early June, included full restitution for every improperly assessed fine across all 7 households, reimbursement for towing and legal costs, a formal written apology from the reorganized board, and a binding commitment to independent third-party auditing of all future HOA enforcement actions for the next 5 years. It also included, at my specific insistence during the negotiation, a new bylaws provision requiring any resident facing a violation notice within 90 days of a documented death, hospitalization, or major medical event in their household to receive an automatic 60-day compliance grace period. A small, specific protection born directly from my own experience. Frank Delgado, having stepped down from the board entirely, agreed to run instead for a newly created independent oversight position the reorganized association created, not a president, but an ombudsman, with no enforcement authority of his own, solely responsible for reviewing complaints and flagging patterns before they could ever calcify into someone's private fiefdom. Ruth nominated me, half joking at first, for the reorganized board itself, an idea I initially waved off, tired after 18 months of fighting just to be left in peace. But Dolores, the Ortegas, and several other families pressed the case, arguing that someone who'd survived the old system might be exactly who should help redesign it. I agreed eventually, on the condition that the new board explicitly limit any single member's tenure to 2 consecutive terms, a structural safeguard against exactly the kind of entrenched, unaccountable authority Karen had spent 6 years quietly building before anyone had organized enough evidence to challenge it. The provision passed unanimously at the next meeting. Karen's trial began in late July, nearly 3 months after the preliminary hearing, in the same modest Phoenix courthouse. I attended every day it was open to the public, sometimes with Mia, sometimes with Ruth, occasionally alone, watching the same evidence I'd spent 18 months quietly gathering laid out formally, methodically, for a jury. The prosecution's case unfolded much as it had at the preliminary hearing, but expanded, additional bank records showing the full scope of the embezzlement. Testimony from 2 more affected families Mia's continued reporting had helped identify, and detailed analysis from a forensic accountant walking the jury through 18 months of diverted association funds. Karen's defense attorney attempted, throughout the trial, to portray her as a dedicated, if occasionally overzealous, community leader who'd simply lost perspective under the pressure of volunteer leadership, never intending genuine harm. The strategy struggled visibly against the recorded 911 call, played again for the jury in its entirety. Karen's calm, fabricated voice filling the courtroom. Tyler Whitfield testified during the trial's 2nd week, delivering, in person, the same account he'd given Mia months earlier about growing up under his mother's need for total control, adding new detail about specific incidents from his childhood that painted a consistent, decades-long pattern rather than an isolated 18-month lapse in judgment. Gerald did not testify against his wife directly, but the prosecution entered as evidence several text messages he'd voluntarily provided, including one from 8 months before the arrest reading, "The fund spending doesn't add up. You need to stop before someone notices," which Karen had apparently never responded to at all. The defense's strongest moment came during closing arguments, When Karen's attorney argued that 18 months of aggressive but technically within authority HOA enforcement, however unpleasant, didn't automatically prove criminal intent behind the single 911 call, suggesting a genuine, if unreasonable, moment of fear rather than calculated fabrication designed to weaponize police response. The prosecution's closing argument dismantled that framing methodically, walking the jury back through 18 months of documented, escalating, disproportionately targeted enforcement against grieving and vulnerable residents, arguing that the 911 call wasn't an isolated lapse at all. It was simply the final, most extreme entry in a long, carefully documented catalog of control. This wasn't fear, the prosecutor told the jury in her closing statement, according to Mia's detailed courtroom notes. This was a pattern of someone who had never once faced consequences deciding to escalate to the most dangerous tool available to her when every other tool had finally stopped working. That's not panic. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours before returning their verdict on a warm Thursday afternoon in early August. I sat in the gallery between Mia and Ruth, Duke waiting patiently in Mia's car outside because courthouse rules didn't permit dogs inside. My hands folded tightly in my lap as the foreperson stood. Guilty on the false reporting charge. Guilty on both counts of fraud. Guilty on the embezzlement charge. Karen Whitfield sat perfectly still as each verdict was read. Her face unreadable. Her attorney's hand briefly on her shoulder. While behind me I heard Dolores let out a soft, involuntary sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh. The judge scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, explaining that a pre-sentencing report would need to account for the full scope of victim impact statements, of which there would apparently be many, given the number of families Mia's reporting and the subsequent civil case had ultimately identified across Karen's 6-year presidency. I gave my own victim impact statement at the sentencing hearing in September, describing, plainly and without exaggeration, what it felt like to grieve a wife of 46 years while simultaneously fighting a slow, exhausting campaign of institutional harassment from someone who'd correctly calculated that grief made me look, temporarily, like an easy target. I spent 31 years protecting people from exactly this kind of abuse of power, I told the courtroom, my voice steady despite the weight of everything behind it. I never expected, at 74, widowed and simply trying to walk my dog and grieve in peace, that I'd need to build a case file to protect myself from my own neighbor. Dolores spoke next, describing the violation notice 9 days after her husband's funeral, and the years of quiet shame she'd carried believing she'd somehow deserved it, before realizing, through Mia's reporting, that 7 other families had experienced nearly identical treatment at their most vulnerable moments, and that shame, properly placed, belonged elsewhere entirely. The Ortega family's son, now 18, spoke about growing up believing his family had simply been unlucky, until he understood the pattern targeting them had nothing to do with luck at all. Frank spoke about fear and complicity, and the long process of learning that silence in the face of someone else's cruelty carries its own quiet cost. Even Gerald spoke briefly, not in Karen's defense, but as a statement of his own, 22 years of marriage that he now understood, painfully and in hindsight, had been built partly on a foundation of control. He'd simply grown too comfortable not questioning until strangers on television forced him to finally see it clearly. The judge, in handing down the sentence, specifically cited the sustained, deliberate nature of the pattern, not a single lapse in judgment, but 18 months of documented, targeted harassment culminating in a knowingly false emergency report designed to weaponize armed police response against a 74-year-old widower with no history of any actual threat whatsoever. Karen Whitfield was sentenced to 4 years in state prison on the combined charges, with the possibility of parole after serving a significant portion, along with a restitution order, covering the full embezzled amount plus damages, and a permanent injunction barring her from ever again serving in any homeowners association leadership role anywhere in Arizona. She showed no visible reaction as the sentence was read, though I noticed, watching from the gallery, that Tyler, seated several rows back, closed his eyes briefly, and Gerald reached up to wipe his own face quickly before anyone could see. Whatever remained of the Whitfield family left that courtroom in 3 separate directions. Outside the courthouse afterward, reporters gathered on the steps, having covered the trial's conclusion for outlets well beyond Arizona by that point. Mia gave a brief statement on behalf of the affected families, careful once again to keep the focus on the systemic pattern rather than personal vindication. I said very little, mostly just relieved. Sergeant Reyes texted me that evening. A short message. Justice took longer than it should have, but you got there, sir. Proud to have been part of it. Even the part where I almost didn't recognize what I was walking into. I saved the message, the same way I'd saved everything else that mattered from the past 2 years. September gave way to a quieter kind of autumn than Willow Creek had known in years. The new board, with Frank as independent ombudsman and myself as a term-limited member, worked steadily through the backlog of fine reversals and policy reforms, most of it unglamorous, procedural work that nonetheless mattered enormously to the families it touched. Dolores, once she'd received her full restitution, used part of it to plant a small memorial garden near the community clubhouse. A modest bed of desert wildflowers with a plaque honoring residents who weathered unfair seasons together and chose, in the end, to build something better. Most people who read it didn't know the full story behind it. The Ortega Boys Skate area was finished by October, well used most afternoons. A small but genuine piece of the neighborhood improving rather than diminishing under new leadership. Ruth planted new roses along her front walk, the kind Karen had once fined a different resident for. Defiantly, though nobody was left in a position to fine her for it anymore. I flew my American flag and the POW MIA flag back up beneath it the week the new bylaws passed, formally protecting military honor displays from any future restriction. Duke sat on the porch and watched me raise it, the way he had watched me take it down 2 years earlier, and I told him this time it was staying up for good. Mia's reporting on the case earned her a regional journalism award that fall, presented at a ceremony I attended proudly in a suit I'd bought specifically for the occasion. She dedicated the award, in her brief acceptance speech, to every resident who kept a receipt they didn't yet know would matter, and to my grandfather, who taught me why that matters. I visited Eleanor's grave again on the 2nd anniversary of her death, sitting with her the way I did most weeks, and told her, finally, that it was over. The fines, the trial, the sentencing, all of it resolved as fully as these things ever resolve. I told her Willow Creek felt like the neighborhood we'd first fallen in love with again. Frank and I still meet for coffee most Thursday mornings, an odd friendship born entirely out of shared survival of the same slow-moving crisis. He told me recently he still thinks sometimes about the votes he cast under pressure, and that being ombudsman now feels less like a job and more like a quiet, ongoing act of amends. Gerald moved permanently into his rental across town and, according to Ruth, has taken up volunteering at the same county food bank Karen once used to burnish her own public image. He waved to me once from across the parking lot there, and I waved back. Some people, I've learned, deserve a second chance to be someone different. Tyler Whitfield reached out to me directly that winter, unprompted, thanking me for not making the case about revenge against his mother personally, but about the actual pattern of harm. I needed to see accountability happen the right way, he wrote. Not cruelty for cruelty's sake. Just consequences. Finally, for something real. I appreciated that more than he probably knew. Karen, according to periodic updates from my attorney friend, has served her sentence quietly, with no reported disciplinary issues, and is expected to become eligible for parole in just under 2 years, at which point the permanent injunction will still bar her from ever again holding any position of authority within a homeowners association in the state. I think about her occasionally, less with anger now than with a kind of clinical curiosity left over from 31 years of studying why people do what they do. 6 years of unchecked power over a small kingdom of lawn heights and mailbox colors. And somewhere in there, she genuinely seemed to believe she was the one keeping order. Ruth still calls Karen's era the reign. A little dark joke that's become neighborhood shorthand. And the community occasionally jokes, gently now rather than fearfully, about the old rules that used to govern their lives down to the exact shade of exterior paint. Nobody measures hedge height with a tape measure anymore. Nobody has to. Mia visits most Sundays still, sometimes bringing new stories she's chasing for the outlet that hired her full-time after graduation, occasionally asking my opinion the way she used to ask for help with homework, though the homework now involves the same kind of patient, careful documentation instincts I taught her almost by accident that year. Duke is 12 now, gray around the muzzle, slower on our walks but still insistent on the same dawn route past the wash trail, no longer needing to avoid anyone's street on the way. I let him set the pace these days. There's no reason left to hurry. And honestly, after everything, I've come to appreciate slow mornings. The accordion folder still sits in my hall closet, thick with 2 years of dated, labeled evidence, though I rarely open it now except when a new HOA horror story hits the news and a reporter or a worried neighbor from another state calls asking for advice on how to build a case file of their own. Willow Creek Estates elected its new board unanimously that following spring. Term limits and independent oversight firmly written into the bylaws. The legal contingency fund replaced with a transparent, itemized reserve account audited annually by an outside firm. It is, by every measure available, an almost boring place to live now. I mean that as the highest compliment. The plaque near Dolores's wildflower garden gets a fresh coat of sealant every spring, and new residents sometimes ask about the story behind it. Ruth usually tells it now, better than I ever could. Ending the way she always does, rules should protect people. The moment they start being used to punish people instead, that's when you fight back. I still keep the porch light on most evenings, though it's less about missing Eleanor now and more, I think, about welcome, a small, steady signal that this house, this street, this whole slow-healing neighborhood, finally belongs again to the people who actually live in it, not to whoever shouts the loudest from behind a folding table. Karen Whitfield built her small kingdom on other people's fear and silence, and it held together right up until the morning fear finally ran out and evidence walked through the door instead, in a pressed dress uniform, with a folder 18 months in the making, and a sergeant who remembered exactly who I really was. The END.